Max heard the howl on his second night alone in the wilderness, and something ancient stirred in his golden retriever heart. 3 weeks later, when park rangers found him, he had transformed from a family pet into the alpha of a wolf pack. His story isn't just about survival, it's about remembering who you really are when everything else is stripped away. The morning had started like any other hiking adventure in Montana's Glacier National Park. Sarah Mitchell, a 34-year-old nature photographer from Denver, had planned a 3-day solo backpacking trip through the remote Belly River Valley. She'd done this route twice before, but never with Max, her 3-year-old golden retriever. This was supposed to be their first wilderness adventure together, a chance to bond away from the distractions of city life. Max had been a rescue dog, found wandering the streets of Colorado Springs 2 years earlier. Sarah had fallen in love with his gentle temperament and intelligent amber eyes during her first visit to the shelter. He'd adapted beautifully to domestic life, house-trained within weeks. Obedient during walks, friendly with neighbors and their children, he was the perfect urban companion, content to spend his days in Sarah's downtown apartment, eagerly awaiting their evening runs through the city parks. But something in Max's behavior had always puzzled Sarah. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit by the window and stare into the darkness, his ears perked and body tense, as if listening to sounds she couldn't hear. When they visited dog parks, he rarely played with the other dogs, instead positioning himself on elevated ground, watching everything with an intensity that seemed unusual for such a laid-back breed. The first day of their hike went perfectly. Max trotted alongside Sarah on the well-maintained trail, stopping occasionally to investigate interesting scents or to drink from the crystal-clear mountain streams that crisscrossed their path. They covered 8 miles through dense forests of lodgepole pine and western larch, climbing steadily toward their planned campsite near a pristine alpine lake. As evening approached, Sarah set up their tent while Max explored the immediate area, never straying more than 50 yards from their campsite. She noticed how differently he moved, out here with more purpose, more awareness. His usual playful demeanor had been replaced by something more serious, more focused. When she called him for dinner, he approached slowly, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. "What's got you so alert, buddy?" Sarah asked, scratching behind his ears as he ate his kibble. Max paused in his eating, lifting his head to stare into the darkening forest. His ears twitched at sounds Sarah couldn't detect. That first night passed without incident, though Sarah was awakened several times by Max's restless movement. Each time she looked, he was sitting upright beside the tent door, perfectly still, watching and listening. She assumed he was simply adjusting to the unfamiliar environment. The second day brought them deeper into the wilderness. They left the main trail around noon, following a narrow game path that Sarah had discovered during her previous visits. This route would take them through a more remote section of the park, where few hikers ventured. The terrain became more challenging, with steep rocky sections and dense undergrowth that required careful navigation. It was during one of these difficult passages that disaster struck. Sarah was carefully picking her way down a loose scree slope. When her foot dislodged a large rock as she tried to regain her balance, more rocks began to slide, creating a small avalanche. She called out for Max to stay back, but in the chaos of falling stones and her own scrambling for safety, she lost track of where he was. When the rockslide finally settled, Sarah found herself at the bottom of a 20-foot cliff, her left ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. Pain shot through her leg as she tried to stand, and she immediately knew she was in serious trouble. But her first thought wasn't for herself, it was for Max. "Max," she called out, her voice echoing off the rocky walls of the narrow canyon, where she'd landed. "Max, where are you?" She waited, listening for the familiar sound of his collar jingling or his paws scrambling over rocks, but there was only silence. Panic began to set in as she realized that the rockslide might have separated them completely. From her position at the bottom of the cliff, she couldn't see the path they'd been following for the next several hours. Sarah alternated between calling for Max and trying to find a way out of the canyon. Her injured ankle made climbing impossible, and the rocky walls were too steep and unstable to scale safely. As darkness began to fall, she accepted the grim reality that she would have to spend the night alone, hoping that Max would find his way back to her. What Sarah didn't know was that Max had indeed been caught in the rockslide. When the stones began to fall, his instincts had kicked in with surprising intensity. Instead of panicking or freezing, he had moved with the fluid grace of a wild animal, leaping from rock to rock until he reached safety on the opposite side of the slide zone. For several minutes after the rock stopped falling, he had paced back and forth along the edge of the cliff, whining and barking in distress as he tried to locate Sarah, when her calls echoed up from the canyon below. Max had attempted to find a way down to her, but every path he tried either led to dead ends or drops that were too dangerous even for his athletic build. As the hours passed and Sarah's voice grew weaker, something fundamental began to shift in Max's behavior. Had confronted for millennia, adapt or perish, and in that moment of crisis, genetic memories that had been dormant began to awaken. As the sun set on his first night alone in the wilderness, Max made a decision. He would survive, and he would become whatever he needed to become to do so. The howl that pierced the mountain air just after midnight seemed to call directly to something deep in his DNA, something wild and primal that had been waiting patiently beneath his domesticated exterior. The sound came from the north, echoing across the valleys and ridges like an ancient summons. Max's response was immediate and instinctive. He lifted his muzzle to the star-filled sky and howled back, his voice carrying a note of longing that he had never expressed before. It was the first time in his life that he had howled, yet the sound felt as natural as breathing. Within minutes, he heard an answer, then another. The wolves were calling to him, and without understanding why, Max knew he had to respond. He began to move through the forest with a purpose and confidence that surprised him. His suburban conditioning fell away with each step, replaced by instincts that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his genetic memory. The pack found him before dawn. 6 adult wolves emerged from the shadows like spirits, materialized from moonlight and forest mist. Max's first instinct should have been to run, to fear these apex predators who could easily kill him. Instead, he felt a recognition so profound it made his chest tighten with emotion. These weren't strangers, they were family he had never met. The alpha female, a magnificent gray wolf with ice-blue eyes and distinctive white markings on her chest, approached him slowly. Her name, though Max would never know it, was Aquila, and she had been leading this pack for nearly 4 years. She was experienced enough to recognize something unusual about this golden-coated stranger who carried the scent of humans but moved with the fluid grace of something wild. Aquila circled Max carefully, her senses cataloging every detail about him. His size was impressive, larger than most of her pack members. His coat was thick and weather-resistant, suitable for mountain winters. But most importantly, there was something in his posture, in the way he held his head and met her gaze without challenge or submission, that spoke of natural leadership potential. The other pack members watched this initial encounter with intense interest. There was Kodiak, the massive black male who served as Aquila's mate and the pack's enforcer. Silver, a lean gray female with exceptional hunting skills and maternal instincts toward younger pack members. Storm, a young male with unusual markings who had recently challenged for higher status within the pack hierarchy. Luna, a white female who specialized in tracking and had an almost supernatural ability to find prey. And finally, Sage, an older, understood about wolf pack dynamics. Most were driven away or killed, but Max's integration happened with unprecedented speed and acceptance. Perhaps it was his size and obvious strength. Perhaps it was the fact that he showed neither fear nor aggression, but rather a calm confidence that suggested natural leadership ability. Or perhaps, as some wildlife experts would later theorize, it was something more profound, a recognition that this wasn't just a domestic dog, but something that carried the genetic memory of wolves despite generations of selective breeding. Within hours of their first meeting, Max was traveling with the pack. He learned their communication system through observation and instinct rather than formal teaching. A subtle ear position meant danger ahead. A specific tail carriage indicated prey nearby. A particular vocalization called the pack together for important decisions, but it was during his first hunt with the pack that Max truly began his transformation from pet to predator. The target was a small elk herd that had been spotted grazing in a meadow about 2 miles from where they'd first met. Aquila had planned a coordinated attack that would require each pack member to play a specific role. Max watched the strategy session with growing understanding. This wasn't random. Chasing it was sophisticated tactical planning that required intelligence, teamwork, and precise execution. As the pack prepared to move into position, Aquila made a decision that would have stunned wildlife researchers. She assigned Max a crucial role in the hunt. His job was to help drive the elk toward the other pack members who would be waiting in ambush positions. It required him to understand not just his own role, but how his actions would affect the entire pack's success. As they began to move into position, Max felt his suburban life falling away completely. The comfortable routine of kibble and dog parks and evening walks seemed like memories from someone else's life. The hunt itself was a revelation. Max discovered that he possessed instincts he had never known existed. He could predict which way the elk would turn before they knew it themselves. His powerful legs carried him over rough terrain with an efficiency that surprised even him. Most remarkably, he found that he could communicate with his packmates through subtle body language and vocalizations that seemed to come naturally. When the hunt concluded successfully, Max participated in the pack's celebration ritual complex. series of vocalizations and physical interactions that reinforced their social bonds. But even more significantly, he noticed that the other wolves were beginning to defer to him in small ways. Storm, the young male who had been pushing for higher status, now waited for Max to eat before approaching the kill himself. Over the following days, Max's transformation accelerated. His coat, once perfectly groomed for suburban life, became thick and weather-resistant. His muscles developed through city park jogging, adapted to the demands of mountain terrain and long-distance travel. His senses, which had been dulled by years of domestic comfort, sharpened to levels that allowed him to detect prey scents from miles away. But the most profound changes were psychological. The anxious, people-pleasing demeanor that had characterized his domestic life gave way to calm, confidence, and natural authority. He began to make decisions for the pack, choosing travel routes, identifying den sites, assessing threats, and remarkably, the other wolves accepted his leadership without challenge. By the end of his first week with the pack, Max had become something unprecedented in documented wolf behavior. A domestic dog who had not only been accepted into a wild pack, but had risen to become its alpha leader. Wildlife cameras positioned throughout the region began capturing footage that would later astound researchers worldwide. The videos showed Max leading hunting expeditions with tactical sophistication that rivaled the most experienced wolf alphas. They documented his role in teaching younger pack members essential survival skills. Most remarkably, they captured moments of pure leadership situations where Max made split-second decisions that meant the difference between the pack's success and failure. Meanwhile, Sarah had been rescued from the canyon by park rangers after activating her emergency beacon. Her ankle required surgery, but she was recovering well at the hospital in Great Falls. The search for Max had begun immediately, involving park rangers, volunteer search teams, and even helicopter surveys. But the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park offered countless places for a lost dog to disappear. The search teams were looking for a frightened, possibly injured domestic dog who would likely be hiding and trying to avoid contact with wild animals. They were not prepared for the reports that began to filter in from remote trail cameras and occasional hiker sightings of a golden-colored canine traveling confidently with a wolf pack park. Biologist Dr. Rebecca Thornton was the first to take these reports seriously. She had spent 15 years studying wolf behavior in the northern Rockies and had never encountered anything like the footage she was seeing. The golden-colored animal in the videos moved with the confidence of a pack leader, not the fearful desperation of a lost pet. "This challenges everything we understand about wolf pack dynamics," she told her colleague, Dr. Marcus Chen, as they reviewed the latest trail camera footage. "Domestic dogs simply don't integrate into wild packs like this, and they certainly don't become pack leaders within a matter of days." Dr. Chen was equally puzzled. "Look at his posture in this video," he said, pointing to a clip that showed Max leading the pack across a meadow. "That's not submission or even acceptance. That's dominance. He's making the decisions for this group." As word of the unusual situation spread through the scientific community, researchers began to propose theories about what might be happening. Some suggested that Max might not be a typical golden retriever, but rather a wolf-dog hybrid whose wild genetics had remained dormant until triggered by the wilderness environment. Others hypothesized that certain domestic dog bloodlines retained more of their ancestral wolf behaviors than previously understood. But Dr. Thornton had a different theory, one that was more profound and troubling. "What if," she suggested during a conference call with wildlife officials, "we've been wrong about the fundamental nature of domestication? What if the wild instincts aren't bred out of dogs but simply suppressed by their environment? What if this dog is showing us what domestic animals are capable of when they're freed from human constraints?" Her theory gained credibility as more footage became available. The videos showed Max not just surviving in the wild but thriving in ways that suggested his domestic upbringing had actually enhanced rather than hindered his natural abilities. His larger size, the result of generations of selective breeding, gave him advantages in hunting and territorial defense. His intelligence, honed through human interaction and training, allowed him to solve problems and adapt to new situations with remarkable speed. 3 weeks into his wilderness transformation, Max had become something unique in the animal kingdom, a bridge between the domestic and wild worlds. He retained certain behaviors from his life with Sarah, gentleness with younger pack members that resembled his interactions with children, a problem-solving approach that reflected his training experience. But these domestic influences had blended seamlessly with his newly awakened wild instincts to create something unprecedented. The pack under his leadership began to exhibit behaviors that surprised even experienced wolf researchers. They became more adaptable, more willing to explore new territories and hunting strategies. They showed increased cooperation and reduced internal conflict. Most remarkably, they began to display a kind of curiosity about human activities that was unusual for wild wolves, though they maintained a respectful distance. It was during this time that Max made a discovery that would prove pivotal to his story. While leading the pack through a remote valley, his enhanced senses detected a familiar scent carried on the mountain wind. It was Sarah's scent, faint but unmistakable, coming from the direction of the park's main visitor center, 20 miles away, that the recognition hit him like a physical blow. Images of his domestic life flashed through his mind: Sarah's gentle hands, scratching behind his ears, the comfortable weight of her presence beside him on the couch, the joy in her voice when she called his name. For the first time since his transformation began, Max felt the pull of his former life competing with his newfound wild identity. That night, as the pack settled into their temporary den, Max found himself torn between two worlds. He had become something magnificent and powerful, a leader of predators, a creature perfectly adapted to survive in one of the world's most challenging environments. But he was also Sarah's companion, her loyal friend who had shared her life and love for 2 years. The internal conflict that Max experienced that night reflected one of the most fundamental questions about the relationship between humans and animals when domesticated creatures are given the choice between wild freedom and human companionship. Which path represents their true nature? As dawn broke over the mountains, Max made his decision. He would not abandon the pack that had accepted him and made him their leader. But neither would he completely turn his back on the human world that had shaped him. Instead, he would find a way to honor both sides of his nature. The solution he devised was as unprecedented as his initial integration into the pack. Max began to lead his wolves on a gradual journey toward the more populated areas of the park. Not to make contact with humans, but to establish a territory that would allow him to keep watch over both his wild family and his human one. Dr. Thornton was the first to recognize the pattern in Max's movements. "He's not just wandering randomly," she told the park superintendent during an emergency meeting called to address the unusual situation. "He's deliberately positioning his pack within monitoring distance of human activities. It's as if he's trying to protect both worlds." The implications of Max's behavior sent shockwaves through the wildlife management community. Here was a domestic dog who had not only joined a wild pack, but had become its leader, and was now apparently trying to bridge the gap between human and wild territories in a way that had never been documented. Park officials faced an unprecedented dilemma. Traditional wildlife management protocols called for either removing the dog from the wild or, if that proved impossible, treating the pack as a threat to human safety. But Max's pack was exhibiting none of the aggressive behaviors typically associated with problem wolves. If anything, they seemed to be more careful around humans than typical wild wolves. The situation became even more complex when Sarah, now recovered from her injuries, requested permission to attempt contact with Max. She had been following the reports of his transformation with a mixture of amazement and heartbreak. The dog she had rescued from the streets and loved as a companion had become something she could barely comprehend. Yet she felt an overwhelming need to see him again. "I don't want to force him to choose," she told Dr. Thornton during their meeting at the park headquarters. "I just want him to know that I'm okay, that I understand what he's become, and that I'm proud of him." Dr. Thornton was initially reluctant to approve such contact. The risks were enormous, not just to Sarah's safety, but to the delicate balance that Max had achieved between his two natures. But something in Sarah's approach convinced her that this might be exactly what the situation required. "If anyone can communicate with him safely," she finally agreed, "it would be you. But we'll need to do this very carefully with full safety protocols in place." The meeting was arranged for early morning in a meadow that had become part of Max's pack's regular patrol route. Sarah would wait alone at a designated spot while park officials and researchers observed from concealed positions. If Max chose to approach, it would be entirely his decision as the sun rose over the mountains on the day of the planned meeting. Sarah sat quietly in the meadow, her heart pounding with anticipation and uncertainty. She had no idea if Max would even recognize her after his transformation, or if the wild wolf leader he had become would have any interest in acknowledging their former relationship. She didn't have long to wait. Max appeared at the edge of the tree line just as the morning mist began to lift from the grass, but he was not alone. The entire pack flanked him, 6 magnificent wolves who moved with the fluid coordination of a perfectly functioning unit. They stopped about 50 yards away, and Sarah could feel their intelligent eyes evaluating her as a potential threat. But Max himself showed no hesitation. After a brief exchange of vocalizations with his pack, communications that sounded more complex than any dog language Sarah had ever heard, he began to walk toward her with the confident stride of a creature completely at home in its environment. As he drew closer, Sarah could see the profound changes that 3 weeks in the wild had wrought. His coat was thicker and more lustrous, his muscles more defined, his posture more commanding. But his eyes, those warm amber eyes she remembered so well still, held the intelligence and gentleness that had made her fall in love with him. At the shelter when Max reached her, he stopped just outside of arm's reach and sat down in a perfect mirror of the pose he had always used when waiting for her permission to come closer. It was such a familiar gesture, so clearly a bridge between his wild and domestic selves, that Sarah had to blink back tears. "Hello, Max," she said softly, using the gentle tone she had always used with him. "I'm so glad to see that you're okay. More than okay, you're magnificent." Max tilted his head slightly, and Sarah could see recognition in his expression. But there was something else there, too, a kind of quiet dignity that hadn't been present during their domestic life together. This was no longer a pet seeking approval from its owner. This was a leader acknowledging an old friend. For several minutes, they simply sat together in the morning sunshine while the pack waited patiently at the tree line. Sarah talked quietly to Max, telling him about her recovery, about how the search teams had been looking for him, about how amazed everyone was by what he had accomplished. "I want you to know," she finally said, "that I understand. I understand that you've found something out here that I could never give you. You've found who you really are, and I'm so proud of you for that." Max's response surprised everyone watching from their concealed positions. He stood up and took a step closer to Sarah, then gently placed his head against her shoulder in the exact gesture of affection he had used countless times during their life together. But this time, the gesture carried additional meaning. Was a bridge between two worlds, an acknowledgement of love that transcended the boundaries between wild and domestic, human and animal. After a moment, Max stepped back and looked directly into Sarah's eyes. What passed between them in that moment was something that could never be fully captured or explained. A recognition, a blessing, and a goodbye all rolled into one. Then Max turned and walked back toward his pack with the same confident stride. But just before he reached the tree line, he stopped and looked back at Sarah one more time. She raised her hand in a small wave, and Max lifted his muzzle to the sky and howled not the wild call of a wolf, but something softer, more melodic, that carried notes of gratitude and love. As the pack disappeared into the forest, Sarah sat alone in the meadow with tears streaming down her face. But they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of wonder, of pride, of a love so deep that it could accept the impossible transformation of someone she cared about into something she could never have imagined. Dr. Thornton emerged from her observation position and walked over to Sarah. "That was extraordinary," she said quietly. "In 30 years of wildlife research, I've never seen anything like it." Sarah nodded, still looking toward the forest where Max had disappeared. "He's become something amazing, hasn't he? Something that nobody thought was possible. The question now," Dr. Thornton said, "is what we do with this knowledge. Max has shown us that the line between wild and domestic isn't as fixed as we thought. He's proven that animals can choose their own path, can become something new that honors both their genetics and their experiences." In the months that followed, Max's pack became the subject of the most intensive wolf study ever conducted. Researchers from around the world came to observe this unique group led by a domestic dog who had transformed himself into something unprecedented in the animal kingdom. The pack thrived under Max's leadership, developing hunting strategies and territorial behaviors that combined the best of wild instincts with problem-solving skills that seemed to reflect his domestic upbringing. They became more adaptable than typical wolf packs, more willing to coexist with human activities while maintaining their wild independence. Max himself became something of a legend in the wildlife community. His story challenged fundamental assumptions about domestication, animal behavior, and the relationship between humans and their animal companions. But perhaps most importantly, his transformation demonstrated that love, whether between human and animal, or between an individual and their true nature, doesn't always mean possession or control. Sometimes love means having the courage to let someone become who they truly are, even when that someone is more magnificent and wild than you ever imagined possible. Years later, Sarah would still visit the park regularly, not hoping to see Max again, but simply to know that he was out there, leading his pack through the wilderness with the same gentle strength that had first attracted her to him at the shelter. She had rescued him from the streets, but in the end, he had rescued himself, and shown the world that the call of the wild isn't always a call to abandon love, but sometimes a call to transform it into something deeper and more profound than anyone thought possible. Max's howl could still be heard echoing through the valleys on quiet nights, carrying messages of leadership, loyalty, and the kind of love that transcends the boundaries between worlds. He had heard the call, answered it, and become something that honored both the dog he had been and the wolf he had always carried within his heart.